Welcome everyone to 52 Living Ideas. My name is Evanique, and I'm here with my co-host Brian. Tonight, we will be going over the Divine Feminine. We will do a brief overview of what we've covered so far, and then we will dive right in. There will be an opportunity for questions and comments between the slides. So we are set to begin. Brian, do you have anything before I start sharing?
No, I think maybe you'd mentioned earlier some topics that you thought were very interesting to you. We might be listening for those in the presentation.
Sure. So I'll go over those really quick. So the one thing is in the first part of the chapter, it talks about the poem The Plowman. I just named it The Plowman. There wasn't really a name. And so I'm gonna go over that when we get to it. But basically it's a description of the uniting of the god and the goddess, the goddess Inanna and the god, and I'm gonna mispronounce this, Dumzi, Dumuzi, thank you. And it is just a little bit of a warning. It is sexual in nature. So but it is done in a way that is classic and beautiful. And it doesn't hold the shame of it, right? Like that we're used to seeing. So we're going to talk about that. That's one thing. And then the next thing is the tree of life. I think it's a theme throughout all types of, I don't want to say, well, I'll say religion, and not religion in an institutional sense, but just religious beliefs. And there's always this talk of the tree of life. It has different connotations. So I just want to talk about that a little bit. And then the next thing is it is a little bit of a comparison to Solomon's Song of Songs. Just a little preview. Some say it's about Innana. So I think that's interesting to explore. And then finally, one of the things we're looking at is like two types of energy. It's small prana and big prana. And the small prana is about a sexual act between two organisms, any type of organisms. And the big prana, it goes a little deeper than that. So I definitely want to discuss that. And then finally talking about yin and yang, dark and light, masculine and feminine. So those are some of the things that I will be discussing throughout. Brian, do you have anything to add?
No, that sounds great. I also have a couple things I'll touch on, but I don't need to add them now.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. I'm just going to start the slideshow.
Oh, okay.
All right. Can everybody see the screen?
Okay, this is a presentation on a chapter from a book by Isabella Price. Maybe people can't see it at this point, but the book is called Goddess Power. Evanique and I consulted several different books on the history of goddesses. And before we selected this one, I think we thought this had the very best format, easy, straightforward, not too long. It didn't have a particular agenda or thesis that it was trying to prove. So it was really a very good introduction, overall introduction to goddess worship and goddesses, which is something that, and the divine feminine, which is something that both Evanique and I are interested in. I might say that this particular one, Innana, was really important for me because in my readings on archaeology and mythology and history, this is the first goddess that really captured my attention and imagination. Her story is so rich, and it's not going to come out in its fullness here. It's just, this is one chapter in a book. We decided to limit ourselves to this book for the purpose of promoting discussion and defining the topic. But this goddess has existed in different reincarnations, if you will, in different forms, different understandings, different embodiments for thousands of years. So it's, if you delve more into her and her history, you will see many different stories, some of them very similar with only slight changes, and then some that are really can be quite different one from the other. I'm not really prepared to recite on all that tonight, but I can flag for you that there is definitely much more to her story than what we're going to present here. The one thing I will say is that Inanna has been called Ishtar by the Akkadians, and was also called Ashera by the different people would say different things because we're starting to get into religion as opposed to mythology. But I think there's no doubt that some of the Israelis, before the advent of what you might call Judaism, which some people say arose when the elites returned from Babylon, the arrival of Ezra and Nehemiah in Jerusalem. Before that time, there was goddess worship among the Israelis, and the name of the goddess there was Asherah, and I think there's little doubt that she's just another reincarnation of Inanna. It is, I think, archaeologically and historically possible to draw connections between them. So you can see that this is a very influential goddess. She started out, well, maybe that'll be coming up in a minute, but the two key stories that I've picked up on in this presentation, they're both out of the chapter, is sacred marriage and the descent into the underworld. The sacred marriage, I think, is something that's been a bit lost in our religious history, but I think is very pertinent today. It's been recaptured by Carl Jung and some of his followers. Descent into the underworld is fascinating because it has not been lost to religious tradition. It's been incorporated time and time again into different mythological and religious traditions. But this is the first account of a descent and return from the underworld that I'm familiar with in written history. So it really is quite a remarkable story. Okay, I think we can go on. Someday I'm going to learn how to do this myself.
Oh, no worries. Just one thing, really quick, when you said like she was the first figure that to go into the underworld and come back, and I was thinking of in Christianity, Jesus, like after her, and it just dawned on me that maybe that's where part of that story came from, where he descended into the underworld and came back to Earth. So just a little thought. So I'm going to move on.
Okay, different sections of the presentation. I'll go through these quickly. I think the more important overview is the one that Evanique talked about, the topical overview. I think that there are a lot of benefits from this Meetup series. We'll talk about that. The context of Inanna, I'll give that again, it'll be, it's impossible to cover it completely, but I'll give it briefly. Sumerian religion in general, again, that religion's been, the Sumerian religions were around a long time. And they migrated from the delta of the Tigris Euphrates all the way over to the Mediterranean. It'll be a very short overview on that. Inanna's many realms and powers. Here I just want to highlight something that is really remarkable about goddesses, I would say in general, is that they tend to have many powers in a polytheistic system. The goddesses, especially the ones we're studying, had many powers, whereas gods tend to have one or two. So that's really a remarkable difference. The two specific roles I want to talk about are the roles that she plays in the sacred marriage and return from death. Well, I want to just very quickly flag that she has had a big impact, or let's say other people accept the fact that she has had a big impact on later wisdom traditions. In fact, the revelations of her stories have went after the translation of cuneiform and the understanding of the Sumerian language were sent tremors through the religious, mythological, archaeological, and historical worlds. And then at the end, we'll have questions and comments. Plus, I think Evanique's made clear, we're going to do questions and comments throughout. That's probably a better approach. Okay.
Yep. So one more thing that I just had a quick thought as you were going through, Brian. When you're talking about Inanna and wisdom, impact on later wisdom traditions, I was wondering if we could have just like a little discussion in the middle of this somewhere. And I'm sure it's in one of the slides, about wisdom in the Bible being a woman, and especially throughout the Old Testament and in Psalms and Proverbs, wisdom is often referred to as a woman. And with going through the presentation, like I said before, one of the things is that in the Song of Solomon, in the Song of Songs, sorry, Inanna is thought to be the person that Solomon is referring to. So I'm wondering if that also came from, because she was very wise and it's a wisdom. So just something to just think about. So I'm going to move.
Okay, the first thing that I want to talk about is the benefits from these meetups. I think that's useful just to focus the mind and try to set the mood. I think it's important to do this to raise the awareness and knowledge of the divine feminine, because I think in the Judeo-Christian tradition that predominates in the West, and also Islam, that God is a male, there is no female God, and so there is no awareness or knowledge of the divine feminine. And I think that it adds so much to have that awareness. The second thing is, once you become aware, it's useful, it really, I think, is useful to express appreciation and gratitude for the divine feminine as we see it manifested in our lives. And this is an opportunity to do that. That's really the third point that I have here. Provide a forum where participants are encouraged to speak about the divine feminine in their lives and in others' lives. Learn about goddess quests as a complement to hero journeys. In typical mythology, you hear so much about the hero journey, where the man goes out, obtains some benefit for the community, and then brings it back to the community. There are also many, many goddess quests in mythology that exemplify the same role for the feminine in our lives, our communal lives. For example, there was Isis, who went to Lebanon and traveled throughout Egypt to retrieve and revive her husband, ensuring stability between generations, both in the political realm and in the family realm. So, but if you listen to these myths, you'll pick up on many, many different quests. This one will be a trip to the underworld. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, one of the things that I've been learning throughout the series is, how these myths travel to different areas and the influence. Like, and Anna has such an influence, not only in Samaria, but in Egypt and, in Babylon and, Jerusalem, all these different areas. And in the first presentation that we gave, we talked about how, a truly mark of a great story or a myth is that it travels, right? And people adapt it. And just wanted the audience to think about, why do you think, especially with these stories about the goddesses, why do you think these stories travel so well, or so many people adapt to them? And also think, like, what is this trying to teach you, and just think about how it applies to your life, right? Male or female, this all can apply to your life. What are you going to take from it? So just something to think about.
Okay, and here in this particular, with Inanna's story, we'll learn about the sacred marriage, which I think is really important. It's something that's picked up on by Carl Jung, and stresses the complementary of the male and the female, which is also brought out in the other goddess stories we've studied with Isis in Egypt and Ocean from the Yoruba tribe in Nigeria. For those who weren't there, by the way, that Yoruba tradition has traveled all to the Caribbean and Brazil, into parts of the United States, and continues to play an important role in geographically very large parts of the world. We'll also identify traditions or aspects of the divine feminine that you would like to understand further. That's particularly true with, I think, Inanna, because there's so much there. I would just add a little gloss to what Evanique said. I don't think it's clear that Inanna influenced the story of Isis, but it's clear that Inanna influenced all the other stories that she flagged. But it's interesting and important that Isis, I think many people believe that Isis and Inanna grew up in stories differently. But to me, the interesting thing is there's so many commonalities. And when you see commonalities between independently developed mythologies, it really, I think, lends strength to the stories. There tends, in my own opinion, there tends to be this predilection in mythology. There certainly historically has been a predilection in mythologies to put emphasis on the exclusivity of your story, the truth of your story, and the falsehood of others. But if you step back and look and see the commonalities, that it doesn't take away from the validity and the force of your story. It really adds to the force of your story when you recognize the validity of commonalities with other stories. Now, understanding the significance of the divine feminine for contemporary religion and spirituality, that's both in Inanna's presence and absence. The goddess as a precursor and as a missing element. And that's something that I'd flagged earlier in the Hebraic, or not Hebraic, the Abrahamic traditions. The goddess tradition has been minimized. Some people would say, well, I think there's some consensus at this point that it was actively suppressed over a long period of time. And that absence is something that is also just worth knowing about and thinking about in terms of its significance. Okay. So the context for Inanna historically and geographically.
Hey, Brian,
Yeah.
sorry. I just wanted to make sure before we go into the, this part. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we move into the heart of the presentation? If you do, you could type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. I'll give it 30 seconds. Okay, hearing none, we can move on. Oh, wait, sorry. Brian. David, I'm sorry, David Miller.
Yes, yes, with going on from what you and Brian have been saying, because my interest is the historical and the political, in the Persian Empire, in the reign of Artaxerxes II, which began 400 BC, his mother was a Babylonian princess, Parysatis or Parysatis, and she worshipped Ishtar. And so her son started building temples to Ishtar for her, and it eventually got incorporated into the Zoroastrian religion. And they formed a trinity with the Holy Family, the Father, the Mother, and the Son. And she was the mother, and they changed her name to Anahita to incorporate her into the Zoroastrian religion. So that was what we call a pagan trinity. And there's argument amongst the scholars whether the Persian were influenced by the Egyptian trinity of their holy family, Isis and her husband Osiris and the son Horus. Yeah. And then there's argument amongst the scholars, although usually they think that it was the Egyptian trinity that influenced Christianity. There's a minority of scholars to think it might have been that Persian Zoroastrian trinity. But of course, the particular group of Christians that the Roman emperors selected, as we know, as today, hate women, to put it harshly, and they neutered the Holy Mother. They made into the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost, which of course is male or neuter at least. So it's interesting. And as Brian was saying, yes, that's part of the process of getting rid of the Holy Mother. Yeah, just very interesting.
Thank you, David. Brian, any thoughts before we move on to Ella?
Well, that's, yeah, I think thank you so much for adding that. That's there are so many currents and so much history. Again, we're talking thousands of years, not just centuries, in a part of the world that had many, many different evolutionary, let's say, transformational developments. And I guess I'd stress the word development there because one tended to lead to and incorporate elements of the other. It's really, I do not know all of them. I'm still learning, and that's for me one of the benefits of these meetups. Again, I'm just paying homage to the divine, and I have, I guess, through in reading in the past, I'm willing to share to you the bits I've read and know, or believe I know. But that's wonderful. If other people in the group have other knowledge, anecdotes or stories to add, that really would add a lot. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you, David. Just one thing I wanted to add too is that, because in so many different religions, the feminine, not just Christianity, but in other religions, the feminine seems to take a almost like a lesser seat to the masculine. Is why I wanted to do this series. Is because I wanted to discover the feminine, and I think it's equal to the masculine. And so by discovering these different goddesses, it's just like, as a woman, it's empowering to see the influence that they had on all different types of religions, and all different types of cultures and the influence that it has. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. So up next I have Ella.
Yes, thank you for it's nice to be able to share because I had read a book on Inanna, and it's nice to be able to share with others who have an interest in it. So Inanna in Samaria, 4100 to 1750 BCE, and as you mentioned, she's also called Ishtar later in the Assyrian culture, I believe. And but it's talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was they say the first story that was written as an inscription on a clay tablet in cuneiform. So it's just ancient, and she's the first, I guess, goddess, that we know of because of this clay tablet that was found. And interestingly, Dr. Gerda Lerner, I was reading about, talks about patriarchy, and her reflection is that it's not an evil conspiracy. It's a system that it rose inadvertently in the ancient cultures, such as the one of the goddess Innana, in the sense that the woman lived to be about 28 years old. That was her lifespan. And there were very few humans populating the earth at that point. And so in the area of Samaria, the whole purpose was to populate. And women had this great power of creating life. And that's a part of what Inanna encapsulates, that power to create life. And but also she ran the government. She was the goddess of the government. She was the goddess of war. So she was a well-rounded and respected and powerful goddess. Okay, so I was really interested in when patriarchy developed and how it did flow into the Old Testament as well. And she notes, Dr. Lerner, that this arose partly from the exchange of intertribal exchanges of women for marriage, in which women were acquiesced and more or less treated in slavery. And these marriage exchanges uprooted young women and gave rise to a nation where men had more rights than women. But again, she notes it started out because we had to populate, and women have to nurse and carry children and so forth. And she stresses that it's not a human condition, and it's not functioning very well right now. And it could be ended as long as we don't think it's God-given. But in Genesis 3:16, it says the husband will rule over you, referring to the woman. The husband is the head of the wife. So that's one of the aspects of it in Judaism and Christianity, is that, and other religions, because males dominate all religions.
Hi, Ella.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I just didn't want to. I just didn't want us to stay straight too far. Like, we're not going to go into the Old Testament too much, especially about the patriarchy. I think it's a great topic. I think it's something we could do in the future. But just to keep it on track and keep it focused on Inanna. we're gonna move on. But thank you so much for all that you added to the conversation. Really
Okay,
appreciate it, and the knowledge that you had was really great. And definitely, we'll look at doing something about more patriarchy maybe at a later meetup. I don't know, but thank you. I appreciate it.
thank you.
So I agree that, can you hear me?
Yes.
That's a great topic. In fact, my wife and I, Penny, who's also here tonight, have been looking at that very topic. There are lengthy treatments of this that we've been reading, and we would like to present exactly that topic at a later date. It could be really at any time, but as a separate topic, because it really deserves a separate treatment. Okay, let's moving on. Yes, what Ella said is correct. Well, she's the first goddess in the historical record, and by that I mean in written records. There were goddesses in prehistory. The Paleolithic had figurines of goddesses, and I think it's generally accepted there was goddess worship before there was writing. So, but she's the first, but of course, it's difficult to say much about that. I might touch on it tonight, but only in connection with Inanna. The Sumerians were an ancient people, I'm reading now, originating in the Tigris-Euphrates Delta. Nobody really knows where they came from because their language is not related. It's not a Semitic language. It's not related to the languages that came in from the West, like the Akkadian and the Assyrian. The Sumerians probably formed the world's first city-states. So these are very early, possibly the earliest city-states, the earliest well-developed civilizations. You also have as candidates the Egypt, the Harappan in India and Pakistan, the Levant, and the Yellow River Valley. But I think Egypt, Harappan, and the Sumerians are certainly, I would think, most agree, are the oldest. Inanna's first temple was located in Uruk, and she was the goddess of Uruk, the top goddess, the top god. And that's one of the world's first cities. Many people think it was the first. Evidence of her worship dates back to 4000 BC through the archaeology. That's even before there was writing, and writing started about 3500 BC, again in Sumeria. As with Ocean and Isis, Inanna became a goddess in an area where there were abundant crops, which enabled the formation of a complex urban civilization based on a system of city-states. I think that's so important because that seems to be the formula for the birth of civilizations and the growth of these mythologies, many of which are very, very similar. In particular, the Sumerians needed to develop irrigation to provide their crops. That distinguishes them from the Egyptians, for example, where you had the floods, and that even I wouldn't say that's a detail, but a difference like that leads to a difference in the mythological record, difference in the stories. Now, since Ella touched on the first goddesses, that Inanna was the first goddess, I think it's probably true that there were earlier goddesses as depicted by figurines that have been discovered in Turkey and Upper Egypt. And those goddesses played a role in everyday life. For example, goddesses were depicted as vultures. Well, nobody really knows, but in my opinion, the vultures are depicted a lot in a lot of the oldest Turkish diggings, Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük, there are vultures there. And then in later records, the goddesses have been associated with the end of life. And I think it's very likely that it's recognized that obviously vultures devour carcasses of animals. I think it's possible that they were also devouring carcasses of humans as part of funeral rites. That happens even today in Tibet. So there's the goddess playing that important intergenerational role that I think has been with her from the very beginning. Also the snake goddess, which has been in the archaeological record before writing in the Paleolithic. And that's, I think that's undergone a tremendous transformation because snakes epitomized, I think, two different things. One was they helped with the growth of agriculture. If you are going to store crops, there's a very good chance that rodents are going to get in there and eat them. Well, we have ways of preventing that today. In Egypt, they had cats, and they deified the cats. In Sumeria, I do not believe they had cats. Instead, they had snakes. And the snakes were the ones who protected the crops. And the goddesses were very closely related to the development of agriculture. So a snake goddess would be seen as a very positive, powerful symbol, not in any way an evil one. Then also the snakes are able to recreate themselves, some form of rebirth by shedding their old skin and emerging with new skin. And that's been seen as their ability to heal themselves and to be reborn. Again, very positive, powerful symbols that are associated with the goddess through transformation and intergenerational propagation. So that's just a little bit of the history before Inanna that I think was incorporated also into her tradition. Then finally here with the spread of Sumerian culture, Inanna's cult spread to the Tigris from the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, which is called Mesopotamia, into the Levant, where she was known as Ishtar or Asherah. Ella asked a little bit about the growth of the patriarchies. There are probably a couple things that I could flag as contributing to that. Yes, the populations were increasing, and especially in Sumeria, and then up in which is the Delta area, and then up into Mesopotamia, the area further up the rivers between the Tigris and Euphrates. And as the population increased, there tended to be more warfare, more fighting over, really, it's established in the record, the archaeological record, including the written tablets, that they were very clearly fighting over the borders between city-states as to who controlled the arable land. And the more there was fighting, the more the gods became ascendant as opposed to the goddesses. And a big breakthrough in that regard for the gods was with Babylonia and the ascendance of Marduk. He's captured in the Gilgamesh. Those Babylonians with Hammurabi probably came in, they were Amorites that came in from the west, and they established themselves, first of all, as raiders. They were more warlike, and they had a male god, Marduk, which they established as the head, as opposed to Inanna or some other feminine god, or goddess. And that's just a part of the trend. They didn't eliminate the goddesses, but the gods became more ascendant. And the other thing I would say about that is that in the very earliest tradition, but in the copper and bronze ages, you had goddesses who were ascendant in as regards the creation and maintenance of agriculture. But when you had the advent of the Iron Age and the invention of the plow, a heavier plow which needed to be pulled by water buffalo or cows, the men, the strength of the men, the larger size of the men, led to them playing a bigger role in agriculture. So again, you'll see the men ascendant, or the gods ascendant, as opposed to the goddesses. So that's just in response to Ella's comment, a little bit about the rise of the patriarchy, but we can go into that in a lot more detail with if we look at the biblical context. And that's all I've got on this slide. I
Thank
guess
you,
we want to do
Brian.
questions and comments, right?
Yeah, but I have a question for you. So in the book, it talks about, the seal of the queen and king, right? And it's always the queen facing her consort and the serpent that's by her side, which is kind of like the biblical of the snake being by Eve. But the difference is, like you said before, this one is kind of protecting the earth. And, somehow that got twisted into the serpent being evil. So I don't know if you want to go into that later, or just, just a thought.
Well, I personally would deal with that later if we talk about the rise of the patriarchy and, as a separate topic.
Okay, that works. All right, and moving on. Does anybody have any questions and or comments? If you do, type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. I'm going to give it 30 seconds before we move to the next slide.
Yes, questions or comments?
Katie, you're up.
I'm going to ask someone else's comment because I was curious about this too. Because for Tao Te Ching, we had always associated, mother source with the birth and creation of the universe, but here we see the divine feminine associated with death. And so there was a question, is this only in Sumerian culture? Have you seen that other places, or any comments? I'm curious as well.
No, I think that this will be flagged again later, but I think that the emphasis is on intergenerational transformation, birth and death. We'll see here later that Inanna is also involved in fertility in the Sumerian context. And that's very similar to Isis in Egypt. She was, her followers were the ones who were the ritualistic people who lamented the dead person at Egyptian funerals. And she also, in her story, had revived her husband from death twice. So Isis is also associated with death, and I don't think it's just death. She's also associated with birth and new life, because she's also she's seen not just as the wife of Osiris, but also the mother, and maybe we'll get into that a bit here today, the mother and the lover of her son. So, and she was the one who nursed Horus as a child, and Horus then is the totem, if you will, or the symbol for the pharaohs, the kings of Egypt. Another one is in, and I have read, I really am not a student of the Indian tradition, but Kali is, I think, associated with death and there's also, of course, there are other goddesses in the Indian tradition that are associated with life. I just see them as being very important in this intergenerational transformation, both birth and death. And I think if you look at life around us, that's kind of the way it is. And also Ocean also had that role where her cult was responsible for birthing, because they had a stronger sisterhood in that, at least based on this story, what we've read in Isabella Price. She really stressed the sisterhood amongst the followers of Ocean in the Yoruba tradition. And that sisterhood was responsible for both birth and death, the rituals surrounding both of them.
Thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Ella.
Yes, I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but it gets back to a point that you had asked or mentioned, Ebony, and the question just raised about evil versus fertility with women goddesses. In the story, the Garden of Eden versus the garden that Inanna plants and grows the tree and so forth and so on. Are we going to go into that? Because that has Lilith has infested her tree, and Lilith is talked about as an evil spirit goddess thing that comes and kills babies and eats babies in the middle of the night and kills people. But she has infested Inanna's tree that Inanna wants to make into her throne and her bed. So that's part of the story. I don't know if you want to go into that, but it also goes in to the question of negativity being associated with goddesses.
Well, we're probably not going to cover Lilith tonight, but Lilith is one of those figures where there's many different associations with her. So probably not going to cover Lilith tonight in that aspect. As far as evil versus good, I think that belongs, and Brian, tell me if you disagree, but I think that's more of a patriarchy conversation that we would have at a later date, or you and Penny would do at a later date. But I think we're just trying to really focus on Inanna and her influence throughout different regions of the world.
Well, I mean, I would love to hear more about Lilith. It doesn't need to be tonight, but the comment I would make is whether it's good or bad, whether it's Lilith or Inanna, based on what Ella said, the realm of birth is one that's where women are powerful. So they rule that realm. And again, I think that's something that's a bit lost in some of the current traditions. There's another thing I guess I would mention in passing here, in that about birth. We have the birth of humans, but you also have in these Sumerian traditions and the other polytheistic religions, you have creation that is going on through intercourse between gods. If there's only one god at the beginning, it's always a little bit problematic how you create the two, usually a son and a daughter. But once that's happened, then all of the gods are created through intercourse, and there's a family of these gods. That's something that wasn't really possible. Let's say it wasn't possible in a monotheistic religion as propagated in the Old Testament and the Bible. So you didn't have creation through propagation, this kind of fertility that that Evanique referenced earlier, the using the human intercourse as a way of understanding creation in the world, because you couldn't use that in a monotheistic religion because you don't have two gods. You just have the one God. So there the word is used as the source of creation for other gods, other realms. Once you create people, then the people propagate themselves through sexual intercourse. And this happens to be similar to the Egyptian approach with Ptah, who was the first god, and he created things by calling them into being, by speaking words. And that's not something that is a part of the Sumerian religion.
Thank you, Brian. Just one more quick point, and then we're going to go to Joe. The biblical creation story is similar, where God was the creator, he spoke everything into being as well. But interestingly enough, in the Genesis story, in the beginning, God is not given a title of father or mother. He's just is. As a matter of fact, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think his name was, Yahweh, or no name, similar to the Chinese and the Tao Te Ching, where it talks about that the Tao Te Ching is the name that is not named. I'm saying that wrong. But the point is, like, the God really has no name. Like, you really can't define God, right? Or a concept of God. I think as we go in and we see later on, human beings, as they do, try to define it. And I think that's another aspect of overall, as we're looking at Inanna, again, we're looking at, like, what is the story that is trying to be portrayed? What is the lesson that is to be had? Like, what was human beings trying to explain when they talked about these gods and goddesses? So just another thought. Up next, I have Joe.
Yeah, just a really quick question. I mean, 'cause it seems like everybody's like read a lot about Inanna. Has anybody come up across anything as far as ancestry is concerned, or regarding Inanna, or anything like that? Because I didn't come across anything that even related to that.
I did not go back and recapture that as I did with the Egyptian, because it was not in the book.
Okay.
Here, but it can be recaptured. I've seen it. I've got it in my
Oh, it is. Okay. So, all right.
yeah.
I couldn't find it either. All
He's
right.
a third, I think a third generation goddess, maybe fourth.
Okay.
It kind of raises an interesting point, because how do God, what's the occasion that gives rise to new gods and goddesses? And the best example, the easiest example that I really like is Hephaestus, or Vulcan, the goddess of blacksmithing. How can you have a goddess of god of blacksmithing before you have blacksmithing?
Right.
And blacksmithing was something that was developed as best we know, in Cyprus, with other places as well, but there's good evidence of it in Cyprus, with the first smelting of copper and the working of copper. And then you had Hephaestus, who was a god that originated in Cyprus, and he married Aphrodite, who some people see as she has some of the powers of Inanna, and that Aphrodite came from the
Right.
coast of the Phoenician coast originally. And that's the way Aphrodite appears. She appears out of the foam under the ocean to Hephaestus, and then they get married.
Yeah, it's
So-
Aphrodite.
What?
Oh, no. Yeah, you're right. No, I thought it was Aphrodite and then, well, who's the other one? Athena? That she's a combination of.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, exactly. That's a good point. Inanna is also, Athena has captured some of the powers of Inanna, especially practical knowledge.
Right, wisdom, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it also Venus also captures Inanna as well.
Yes, exactly. So in the evolution of her as a goddess is that her different attributes became embodied by different goddesses over time. And again, when we talk about time, we're talking thousands of years. So
Right.
what a tremendous evolution. But it's also interesting, Aphrodite, as I understand it, was beauty and commerce. So I'd have to look back on that, but that's my recollection. And so, of course, the Hephaestus, that's a craft that you make things, and then they get traded with the Phoenicians through commerce. So the marriage of Hephaestus with Aphrodite also captures this, the trade, the copper trade between Cyprus and Phoenicia. So, and I mentioned that just because that's how that can be the source of evolutions in technology and civilization, can be the occasion for creating new gods and goddesses.
Right. That's an excellent point. It's an answer to a problem in many cases. Yeah, I mean, whether it be commerce, whether it be reproduction, or any of these things, that yeah, these goddesses are representation of the ideal. So of something that can transcend reality.
Yes, I think they tend to be, I use the word spirit, they tend to be viewed as the spirit that animates these different activities, the movement of stars in the sky, the movement of wind in the, amongst us, all of these things that are animated have spirits, and they tend to be, in some traditions, they tend to be, certainly in the Middle Eastern tradition, they tend to be anthropomorphized as gods and goddesses. But another reason I mention that is that Inanna is interesting. She really has a long career, in that she was there at a very early stage, playing political roles, government, just as Ella said, government, war, all the rest. She was the city god for the top god, I don't think the only god, but the top god for Uruk, which was the first city-state. She was a big deal. But when there were, and that's one of the birthplaces of civilization. But as civilization evolved and new skills and crafts were developed, they did not develop new goddesses. Instead, Inanna acquired all of these skills. She embodied all of these different skills. She had many, many different attributes, many, many different realms in which her spirit ruled. And that's something that I think distinguishes her and from later goddesses, and also makes her very similar to Ocean, very similar to Isis, and very different from the gods that we run across incidentally as we're looking at this history of goddesses.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Ella.
Yes, I just, she was the queen of truth, Inanna was, over war, speech, kindness, perception, animals, procreation, family, counsel, politics, prostitution, strife, and sentiment. All of the guild workers. So all of the workers. So she had a lot of power. Apparently, from what I could glean, her husband tried to make her happy in every respect. And was happy to let her rule over anything she wanted to, but she decided to make a journey into the underworld. And I think it's,
Ella, I'm just going to pause for on that because we're going to get to that
oh,
in the
okay.
in the presentation. So
Okay. I'm
yeah,
just,
just to keep the conversation moving. So thank you. All right, I'm going to move on to the next slide, Brian.
Okay. So Sumerian religion in general, we've already touched on some of these points. There were many gods and goddesses forming a family and a genealogy, as in Egypt. I did not try to recapture that for this slide because it's complicated. And also it's not covered in the book. But there are, in some ways, there's a history similar to the Greek history where the gods replace the giants. So there's that kind of evolution. And then once you get the gods, then they procreate, and there's 3 or 4 generations there before you get to Inanna. In that regard, it's very similar to the Egyptian, where the very first gods and goddesses were involved with nature, and then the later ones became embodiments of civilized spirits. So that's just a very short rundown. I'm not, I have listened to it, this genealogy, many times. It is difficult to capture. Because there's more than one God, creation occurs as acts of divine procreation and other acts. Violent conflict, or procreation. The violent conflict would be like the story of Gilgamesh, where he kills Tiamat, who is the goddess of chaos and water. The father, Apsu, has already been killed. He's the father of fresh water. He was killed by some other gods. And then Marduk is the one has killed Tiamat, cuts her into lots of pieces, and creates different elements of the natural world. It's an interesting story, and definitely worth studying and talking about. But I think a big takeaway is that we don't have a single God who's speaking things into being. It's these are events that occurred, between and amongst gods. So gods sometimes new gods were created. They did have new gods, were created to embody the spirit of new places and activities. Every city tended to have its own god or goddess. And again, there are many different cities that grew up, some more important than others. They all had their god or goddess. I've heard it characterized as a mascot or a totem. But they did not deny the existence of other gods. I think everyone in Sumeria recognized the existence of Innana, but she just happened to be the goddess of Uruk, not the god or goddess of Lagash. So, or Ur or Nippur, or the other cities that existed in the area. There were new gods and goddesses created when civilization evolved, but I've already given that example. And Ella was great in bringing in the fact she listed all the different realms in which Inanna embodied the spirit. These are realms where she ruled. And I think it's fair to say that rather than creating new gods or goddesses, as civilization evolved, she acquired all of those attributes of civilization. For example, the guilds. I think that's so important. All of these new crafts. By the way, the economies in those places were tied closely within the city were tied closely with the temples, but you did have trade between cities, basically trade between temples. And I will also mention, again, it's just so striking that goddesses have so many different traits. Ocean, again, in the Yoruba culture, she's the goddess of all the guilds. It's the same thing. And I think that's until you start getting separate goddesses, that's something you'll see repeated over and over again. All right, and I've covered the last point already, that as in Egypt, gods often started as the patron god of a specific city. Marduk was the patron of, a male god was the patron of Babylon, who became ascendant under Hammurabi, and who was an Amorite king. He came in, basically came in from the west, the more arid regions. Inanna was the patron goddess of Uruk, one of the first world cities, and we've already covered that. So that's useful to know, because there really gets to be a tremendous interplay between the roles they play, as you know, in the political realm, as basically the god or goddess of a city or a region, and then all of these other realms in which they animate activity.
All right, so I see that David's hand is raised. So David, you have a question or a comment?
I just wanted to back up what Brian was just saying. Of course, the point is that all these various cities with their own pantheon of gods were often in battle and conquering each other, and then being defeated by another city, or alliance of cities. So of course what they simply did was they incorporated, being polytheistic, they incorporated each other's gods, and sometimes of course the gods took on each other's aspects, as Brian was saying, and or as seen as the one god, or so all the aspects of the god. That's part of why they're all being amalgamated together, or their attributes are amalgamated together. So yes, I found the same problem as Brian. It really gets complicated when you try and read up about it, because every time there's a battle, and of course there was nothing but constant battles, unfortunately, throughout history. So it's it's changing all the time. So it's very difficult to follow, what the god represented at any one particular point.
Thank you, David. Brian, do you want to respond?
No, I think that's exactly right. It's what we're pulling out one thread. We're following one thread in a very complicated story. You could look, and I guess we'll make this point now. You could look at the same history from the history of gods as opposed to goddesses. And I have said that goddesses play an important intergenerational function, and I think that's true with birth and death. They are ascendant in those realms. And that's captured also in the rituals of Uruk, the rituals that involved Inanna. And we'll get into that with the sacred marriage, where it's the priestess who in effect confirms the ascent, or the coronation, if you will, in modern terms, the coronation of the new king. The new king is selected in different ways, or again, we're talking about millennia. It can be, depending on the circumstance, it could be battles or consent amongst the elders in the city or amongst different families. It just depends. But the sacred marriage, which we'll get into, was preserved for a very long time and was the ceremony that confirmed this selection as the king. So again, you see the goddess as the factor of continuity between kings. But if you were to stop and look at it from the other hand, at some point the priestess is going, and it's the priestess who embodied the goddess here. The priestess is going to die. or maybe at an earlier age is replaced. Well, it tended to be the king who did that, or the people, other people in conjunction with the king. So there's also, if you will, the king also played a role as regards preserving the continuity of the religious order. And this is really no different from what was going on in Europe with the popes and the kings. The popes would ordain the kings, but also the kings would influence who became the popes, depending on the era we're looking at. So that's really, I think, a good way to understand what was going on. In this series, we're talking about the role of the goddess. I think it's absolutely correct that she, the goddess, and women in general played the key role in birth, death, and other transitional issues. But at some point, you have to come up with a new priestess, and kings tended to be involved in that.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to move on to the next slide.
Inanna's many realms and powers. So again, thank you to Ella for highlighting. She had celestial powers. She had powers in the natural realm, in civilization. All of these three realms, which are identical to Ocean and Isis. They also had these realms. She was seen as her totems or symbols in the sky were the moon, the morning and the evening star, which is the Venus star, and the star Sirius, which was I think played a role in determining when to plant crops. In nature, Inanna was considered the queen of earth, and as such, she was the goddess of fertility, love, and the seasons, or agriculture. Very important issue. Civilization, but I tend to call it practical knowledge. Some people call it wisdom, phronesis, and there's so many. Again, we're talking millennia and centuries here, but there's a continuity of the women embody the wisdom, the practical knowledge, and the transfer of that knowledge from one generation to the next. And then I think, again, an important point is that the women tend to have a lot of different realms, which makes them very different from the gods. So that's the points I have there.
Yeah, just one thing I just wanted to add when we're talking about nature, and actually, yeah, I'll talk about it now. As such, she was the goddess of fertility, love, and the seasons, agricultural for the Sumerian people, and that's one of the things that I was talking about, the poem where they talked about uniting the goddess and the god, and the one thing that's to note is that each person had their role. Inanna had her role. She was the bearer of children, or fertility, but her husband was, the one that fertilized. So it was equal parts, and I thought, that's beautiful. Everybody takes their role. Another thing that I thought was very interesting in this section is the simple fact that, Inanna was not known as a mothering type. Like, she was the symbol of fertility in that she gave birth, but and I thought this was unusual with her, is that she did not mother her children, in a sense. She just kind of had them, and it seemed like from the book, she had them and moved on. Like, she wasn't the nurturing motherly type that we see from other goddesses that we have studied in the past. And I think this is the first one that we've studied that I haven't seen that. I know there's going to be other ones coming up in the future series, but I just wanted to bring that point that I thought was very important. So before we move on, does anyone have any questions and or comments?
Let me just say that that's a great point. That's one that I also, I mean, I complimented that here in the slide by saying that, and I think that's a big difference between the realm of goddesses and gods, is that when you look at goddesses, they tend to not to have exclusive powers within a realm. And so we'll see in our stories here, the sacred marriage is all about that, that Inanna shared her powers with Dumuzi, her son, lover, and husband, and that her powers are complementary to his. That's so much like Isis. It's really very similar to Isis.
Thank you. Myron, you're up.
Hi, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you for this presentation. It's been really great. I mean, it is really great. Going off of what I'm learning from you so far about all the different roles of Inanna and, you know, the sheer like interdisciplinary nature of her powers, I would prefer to equate her with Hathor rather than Isis, at least for like really early Egyptian theology. Just like how Hathor's husband, son, and lover was Ra. How Hathor was all about fertility and securing of livelihood.
Yes, I would. I would endorse that. I certainly do not disagree with that. Some people believe that, and I think there's evidence now, archaeological evidence for that, that Hathor precedes Isis, and that a lot of Hathor's attributes were acquired or assimilated into Isis. And that sort of assimilation went on into the Hellenistic period. But even in the Hellenistic period, you did have reverence and recognition of Hathor, as well as Apis, the bull god. There's the Apis bull and Hathor, the cow, and there's evidence of their worship dating back or predating Isis. And it really is impossible, I think, at some point it becomes impossible to separate them because they tended to share attributes. But if you wanted to give precedence to the one that occurred first, I think it would need to be Hathor. Yes, I agree with that.
Thank you, Brian. Up next, I have Ryan.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question from Brian. These terms, Hathor and Isis, what are they? Are they gods? Are they places? What are we talking about?
They are goddesses, and Hathor was a cow goddess. Isis was embodied as a person.
Okay.
In some of her representation, she would have some of the attributes of a cow. That did happen sometimes. But interestingly, if relying on what was said earlier, both of them seem to have been identified with the horizon and Ra, and that's important because in the Egyptian theology, the horizon gave birth to the sun every day. And so here again, we have the goddess horizon giving birth to the Ra, the male sun god.
Oh, thank you so much for clarifying.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next slide.
Okay, now we're going to get into the hierogamos. That's how I pronounce it. The sacred marriage, which I think is, I think that really captures something that's overlooked so much in current life, and that is the working together of men and women, and adding to that, the very important role that women have. I think it is true that women typically develop and exercise more skills in life than men do. Men tend to be very limited in what they develop. It's not always true, and that's evolving, but I think there is a tendency that way, just as it's as reflected in these mythologies. So the sacred marriage, I think, is really, not all of that's captured, all of these points are captured in this story, but I think the sacred marriage is a very important idea, and it's one that's picked up with Jung, and that's referenced in this chapter, which I think is really a very good chapter in the Goddess Power book by Isabella Price. In Jung's thinking, as presented by her, as each person seeks individuation, so more and more definition in their personality and differentiation, more subtlety and nuance in their reactions and actions in life, they tend to become more of a whole person. And you can talk about that as integrating the self and the shadow. It can also be the animus and the anima, the male and the female. And there's a feminist psychologist, Carol Gilligan, who writes about that. And I think that's just an excellent point. One that's epitomized in my mind by the image of the Bodhisattva in the Mahayana Buddhism, where it's really a very androgynous. Bodhisattvas tend to be represented as very androgynous figures, so neither male nor female. So here it is, the sacred marriage. It involved a ritual sexual intercourse between Inanna's high priestess and the city-state's king or high priest, depending on the era. The king or high priest would represent Dumuzi, who was also sometimes known as Tammuz. The intercourse was part of the New Year's festival. That happened in fall, because that's when the planting occurred in Mesopotamia. The intercourse was part of the New Year's festival each fall to ensure the cyclical renewal of nature and an abundant harvest for the people of ancient Mesopotamia. And the last point here, it was agricultural prosperity, not a human child, which was the anticipated outcome of this sacred union. So it's a reenactment that's for the benefit of the whole community. It's not designed to give birth. The intent is not to give birth to a child, or even to capture that as an archetypical action. It's to capture the role, to capture the agricultural cycle, which was so important, absolutely foundational, and still is foundational in our civilizations. We don't appreciate it so much. We take it for granted. But back then it was the innovation, and it was seen as the internet. It's seen as the electric car. It was seen as the thing that gave rise and made our city possible. And they reenacted that and tried to perpetuate it through this sacred marriage. And there's, I guess, one observation that I have about that is that this presupposes the existence of a fairly well-developed hierarchy in the city-state, because these are people in high places which are acting on behalf of or acting for, and somehow exercise some power for the whole community. So it presupposes the king, it presupposes a priestess that has a realm, a jurisdiction that encompasses the whole city. And it is not any kind of a personal event. It's a very public civic duty. I think it has, obviously, by analogy, it has implications in many, many other fields. And I've touched on some of those, for example, in connection with Carl Jung. But I think it's something that's overlooked a lot in religion and even in academic spheres, because there's so much focus on the individual, so much focus on the hero quest, which now I've tried to supplement with the heroine's quest, or the hero journey and the heroine's quest. But still, those are individual. And if you think about your life, you really can't, it's not, yes, it certainly is possible to do things on your own, but that is not customary. You tend to do things in cooperation with other people. And that tends to be what gives you strength and power. And that's something that is captured here in the Heroes Gamos. Again, it's not just capturing a heterosexual relationship, it's embodying something I think that is much, much broader and much more important. That's all I've got on that slide.
Does anybody, Dave?
Yeah, I'm enjoying listening to you, Ebonique and Brian. A question about this saying the New Year's festival in the fall. Now, I know a lot of countries or cultures have a harvest celebration. You know, we have Thanksgiving here in our country, but it seems to me, although I can understand maybe the harvesting of the food will be nourishment for the people, but as far as creation, I would think in the spring when the crop is planted. And I would like to tie that. I have had the fortune to visit Iran, Persia, and their New Year's is in March. My birthday is March the 10th, and I noticed, because it's always close, just talking to my buddy Google, this year it's Monday, March 21st, is their New Year's celebration. And I'm thinking, you know, it's not the shortest day of the year or the longest day there, but I wonder if it has more to do with, okay, now it's when we're going to go out and plant the seeds and start the creation. Thank you.
Yes, I agree totally with that. I think the key thing is when the planting occurs. I thought I'd picked up in this chapter that in ancient Sumeria, the planting occurred in the fall. And that also surprised me a lot to see that. And there wasn't really an explanation for it. I might have misunderstood, but I think that, yes, the key thing is the planting. It's certainly, and they do go off a bit, or Isabella goes off on the fact that it's very hot and dry in the summer there, and that they didn't grow crops then, they grew their crops in the winter. And there are parts of the world, I guess I accepted that as credible, because there are parts of the world now that have 2 seasons of crops, one winter and one summer. But I agree absolutely with you. It's all about planting the crops. She does talk also in this chapter, she draws parallels with the Celtic calendar. And again, the new year is when the crops are planted, and there the Celts are living further north. There it's the spring.
Thank you, Brian. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? All right, so I think it's safe to say we can move to the next slide.
Yeah. Okay, the sacred marriage. It also was the political succession of kings. The Inanna is essential for the transfer of power from one king to the next. In other words, she provides, again, and these are my words, intergenerational continuity in political and in the royal family life. So again, we already have a city-state in place, and there are different ways that the kings are appointed, but we do have this kingship. In early, I have to say, in earlier periods, it was the priesthood that evolved into a kingship. But this was, there was some official capacity where the sacred marriage played a role in confirming or the selection of the top political official. And that's, I think, very important in terms of stability and continuity. So the understanding was this was reenacted as mentioned by the king or priest and the priestess, but it was understood to be, as I've written here, that the god Dzumi, who was Inanna's husband, was believed to provide the fertilizing power for the earth, and Inanna was the earth, and that this fertilizing action ensured abundant harvests. Dumuzi, the god, and here, this is where we get into the succession issue. Dumuzi, the god, bestowed his power on the erstwhile king or high priest. So it was always Dumuzi who was embodied in the king or the high priest. And the king was responsible, the one who impregnated the soil, was for ensuring the harvest by impregnating the high priestess at the Hirogamos. But then, if that doesn't work out, you can read further. If there's a poor harvest, and here it could be a poor harvest or harvests or a series of poor harvests. If there's a poor harvest, it was time for the selection of a new king. And the new king or priest was considered to be the son lover of Inanna. This is right from the book, very similar to the arrangement in Egypt, where the king starts out as the son of Isis, but at some point he's going to marry somebody new, and this new person, not going to marry his mother typically, but the new person then embodies Isis. So this king has been both the son and the husband of Isis, as embodied in two different people. The king or the high priest became Inanna's son by selection processes which differed over the centuries and by circumstances that I talked about. The king's status as lover husband was consecrated in the Heros Gamos. So the selected candidate changed from the son to the husband lover at Heros Gamos, the first Heros Gamos. That's my interpretation. Those are my words. But I think that captures fairly what was going on. A similar dynamic is in play in the Oedipus story, where the king, the son prince kills the king father and then sleeps with the queen mother. A very similar dynamic, given a completely different twist by the Greeks, but a very similar story. And then I've already made this last point. Conversely, the king would select a new high priestess as needed. So I see it more or less as walking through time with and we're talking here about the steps, the step where there's a succession in kings, and there the priestess plays a role in continuity, but there are replacements of the priestesses, and there in that succession step, the king or the king and others plays a role in appointing the new priestess. Again, we're talking about millennia here, not just centuries, and these processes can evolve, but I think it has been consistent that there is this role for Inanna and her priestess throughout time.
Thank you, Brian. For sake of time, I'm just going to keep it moving. is we are at 10:40. So, and I think we've already covered this. So
Yeah.
people have asked questions.
So another important role is Inanna's death and revival. The first role is something I think is neglected a lot in modern, to our detriment. I'm going to say in the Abrahamic religions and in modern life. And this other story now embodies something that has been captured in modern religions, and that is the death and rebirth. In this case, it's Inanna's quest, and I've read different interpretations of this story, and I'll give you different retellings of this story. Maybe Ella can also chime in on this. I'm giving you what's in the book, first of all, which is, I think, a fairly short retelling. Inanna is the queen of heaven. These are not exactly the words from the book, but a summary. Inanna is the queen of heaven and earth. She decides she wants to rule the underworld as well. The underworld is the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. And this is from the book. How she came to that point is already a long story. Maybe Ella can tell us something about that. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, Inanna is allowed to pass through the gate only after being divested of one of her divine powers or worldly prerogatives. And then finally, Inanna enters the throne room of Ereshkigal, her sister, and her sister kills her with the eye of death. So some nasty stare. Inanna then hangs like a rotting corpse on a hook for 3 days. Again, these are words from the book. And during those 3 days, Inanna gains essential insights into the full circle of existence, which of course aren't useful to the community unless she comes back to life and goes back to Earth, but that'll happen in the second part of the story. But here it's interesting that she hangs like a rotting corpse on a hook for 3 days. So she's in the underworld. She's the goddess of the moon. This captures the idea of the new moon. I think it's the period of the new moon, when in effect there's no moon shining in the sky, is in a lot of ancient traditions is considered to be 3 days. And that's a fair measurement. So Inanna disappears. Where is she? Well, she's in the underworld, hanging on a hook. She's been killed by her sister. Again, Evanique, I think, has already anticipated this a bit. This is very similar to the story of others. There are many others who in Middle Eastern stories, many others who have died, descended into hell or somewhere for 3 days and then come back to life. And one of them is Jesus. So if this pattern is one that is retained and captured in the New Testament. So this is preserved as a part of our, if you will, this pattern is preserved as a part of our religious tradition. And so that makes it a little different from the sacred marriage. So I'm ready for the next slide.
I just wanted to add something to this one. And I know there's been several questions about it, that the goddesses that's representing death. The one thing that I think we have to point out is that before, there was a negative connotation of the underworld, right? People didn't understand it. People didn't know. I mean, in Egyptian culture, I should say, circling back a little bit, in Egyptian culture, it was one of those things where it was kind of celebrated and, was seen as a transition. But in many cultures, it wasn't like that. And so this story, like I said before, going back to what is it trying to tell you, think of it as destruction, creation. Both are essential in order for new things to come. Some old things have to die off. And I think, especially with Inanna having to be stripped of all of her powers before she could even be presented to Eshkagol, and only by being there and being hanging on that corpse could she ascend again. That's just very important because it just, like, she had to be vulnerable, like, and she had to, in order for her to even get through the gate, she had to be able to strip something off. And that's like something that we can look at, like, in order to do something new or, create something new, you kind of have to strip off the old self or the past self in order to transition. So I think, and you're going to go into it in the next slide, and then we'll take questions and comments. But just want people to pay attention to the transition part.
Okay, in part 2, when Inanna does not return, Enki, the god of wisdom, and he is either her father or an uncle, realizes that this is key, realizes that civilization in Sumer would regress to a primitive stage if Inanna is not rescued from the realm of the dead. It just shows how essential she is for the civilization of Uruk, which arose really out of the mud and dust of the Tigris and Euphrates Delta. The I would think, being back in that time, would feel rather precarious, and you'd be rather proud. And the entity or spirit that enabled all of that would be very important indeed. And he goes on to say, this is what Enki said: after all, it was she who brought the gift of civilization to Mesopotamia. So Enki devises a plan which returns Inanna from the underworld to the realms of heaven and earth, so reinstates her. And in the process, Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, is sent to the underworld as her surrogate. That's required somehow under the interplay of powers amongst these gods. But his absence, Dumuzi's absence during the entire year, eliminates agriculture. You can't have any more sacred marriage. So to restore agriculture, Inanna's sister agrees to take Dumuzi's place in the underworld during 1/2 of the year, ending at the time of each year's planting season in the fall. And again, David's point's a good one. The key thing is the planting, and I got the fact that it was in the fall out of the book. We can put a question mark on that. In this way, so by bringing Dumuzi back, beginning in the fall, Dumuzi and Inanna can continue to consummate the annual sacred marriage, ensuring the propagation of plants and a good harvest.
All right, so if anybody has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom. All right, hearing none, we're going to move.
So the sacred marriage in history, it's a repeated, I use the word repeated pattern and common patterns because some of these references can be traced back to Inanna and Sumerian religion. Others have not been. So I just talk about them as common patterns. Isis, Osiris, and Horus, I think that, it's up in the air. These things are always changing, but seen as a common pattern. Repeated pattern, I think people would say that Solomon's Song of Songs may well have been derived from poems and other literature associated with or beginning with the Heros Gamos. There's imagery in Jewish tradition, again, this is from the book, that sees the soul as masculine. That would be embodied in each person, and the feminine, the wisdom is feminine. So again, the more enduring, disembodied wisdom, ensuring stability. Also, there's some imagery that the Sabbath is the bride, I guess, of Yahweh. I didn't pick up on that part. In Christian imagery, you have the New Jerusalem, the church, the individual soul, and the individual person as the bride or female lover of Christ. So again, you need the male and the female as integral parts of the cosmology, the institution of the church, the religion. Vajrayana Buddhism is discussed in the chapter, and that Ebony might talk more about that, the yin yang, and then the Jungian psychology. I've already talked about that. The seeing the masculine and female qualities as being important for pursuing individuation and becoming a whole person.
Yeah, just to quickly just summarize this whole thing. I think the one thing that we see again is this masculine feminine energy, and it's essential. And specifically with Inanna, you can see, and I mean, in all these examples, you can see that, you know, even that masculine and feminine are seen as both necessary and equal. And when one is out of balance, it just goes away. Like looking in particular, and the imagery in Jewish tradition is wisdom is feminine and soul is masculine. If you don't have wisdom, then, you know, your country falls in a sense. So just as an example like that, you know, you need that. So are you ready to move on, Brian?
Yes, unless others have questions or comments.
Ella.
Yes, Ebonique and Brian, you've covered it very thoroughly. I would just like to add that, you know, Inanna's going into the underworld was like the hero's journey in a way. She commanded the upper world and the sky. She was the queen of heaven and had, as we discussed, many ruled over many things on the earth. So she died. She was hung on a meat hook and dried out, and in the underworld. So a sacrifice had to be made, and that was to replace her in the underworld, which is often the case in rituals. A sacrifice has to be made, and continues in many rituals today. And another theme is the dying to arise again. And this has all been touched on by both of you. This dying to come back again and, you know, to rule again. And she did. She sort of worked things out. You know, she made a sacrifice. She worked to, you know, figure everything out so that she got back and she got into power again. But she had to go there. She had to shed the ego and go into the underworld and shed her physical body in the process and then arise again.
Thank you, Ella. Brian, do you want to add anything or?
No, I think Ella and then Ebonique, you earlier really made the point very well. That she, by going through this journey of life and death, this transformation, she was transformed and came back a wiser person.
All right. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, enduring symbols in Inanna's story. This is again, I don't know how we're going to handle this, but that's really kind of the wrap up of the comprehensive review. But it's important to note that there are so many symbols important in Western mythology and religion, which find their first expression, their first written expression in the story of Inanna. And the tree of life and the serpent are two of them. The shepherd king is another, the sacrificed king, the divine shepherd. All of these are terms used to describe Dumuzi. And then again, we've touched on this, many of the goddesses in later mythology, both Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Canaanite, Israeli, Greek, and Roman, they can all be traced back, maybe less the Greek and Roman, but traced back to directly to Inanna. Very important figure in Western history.
Yeah, just to add on to what you said, and I like when I first studied Inanna, I didn't realize the influence she had, and but not only in Western history, but in history, right? But particularly like her influence even in the Bible that I wasn't aware of until I read this chapter, and I had to read it a couple times to really understand her impact. And I will confess, there's still so much to learn about this, and and seeing other goddesses in Western religions. So I just want to say thank you to Brian for really recommending this book and recommending that we do Inanna. And for giving us this presentation, which I just think was excellent. So do we have any questions and comments? David.
Yes, I just wanted to make to point out that in the Bible, in the Old Testament, Asherah, is constantly mentioned and condemned as part of the as a polytheistic fertility symbol, and it's pictured as it says. And it constantly refers to that she's hanging from every green tree. And what the archaeologists tell us, it was a figurine, usually in terracotta, of a voluptuous female holding up her breasts. And as I said, the Bible constantly, over and over and over again and again, condemns the polytheistic practices of these fertility worship of the both the Israelites and the Judeans. And so you'll find, right up to the time when the Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, in like the end of Kings. And in fact, if you look at those last pages of the Book of Kings, you'll find really when there's only a couple of kings who try to impose monotheism, they start throwing all these things out. There's even statues to Asherah in the Jerusalem temple, which King Josiah, he's about roughly 600, 610 he dies, 609 to be precise. But the Bible really is pleased with him because he's throwing out all these symbols of Asherah hanging from every green tree. But so if you look it up, you'll see she certainly is mentioned and, of course, condemned.
Yeah, that's something, again, I think we definitely will go off on that as a separate important topic. It might take more than one session. Those are excellent points to try and understand how the goddess was really actively suppressed in what has become our religious tradition.
All right. So, Brian, did you want to go over this last? No, this isn't the last slide, right?
Yeah, this is the last slide, but it's really stuff that we've kind of touched on already. Maybe people have more to add or been holding back. Okay, how did Inanna and her successors disappear from Western wisdom traditions? Well, we can go into that. There seems to be a lot of interest and knowledge that I'd like to gain from you. Reflections on your life experiences as regards the presence or absence of Inanna and an appreciation for her. Did you gain any new concepts or insights, confirmations of old concepts or insights, comparisons with other goddesses? We've done a fair amount of that. Or any other comments or questions?
All right, Joe, you're up, followed by Myron.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the rise of Christianity actually was one of the reasons why she actually disappeared from modern conversations, or and I think that it's interesting because she does have so many unique kind of things that she's governing over. We actually went over, and I really thought that it was interesting. I think Ella already.
Oh, we're not hearing you.
Yeah, he's muted. Hold on. I don't know how that happened. Joe, can you unmute yourself?
Finally, I could. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was
Sorry
it
about
coming
that.
up? I don't know where I left off.
Oh, you were talking about influences and that it's
I think I
the
went into.
elimination of the goddess was when Christianity started or Christianity was built up.
Yeah, part of it was, I mean, the rise of Christianity, but I think that now I forget actually what I was going to say. Actually, you can come back to me.
Sorry, Joe.
No, that's all right.
We have Myron followed by Ryan.
I think the first question, how did Inanna and her successors disappear from Western wisdom, is such an interesting question. I think I actually want to try to tackle it by asking response questions. One is, first of all, did Inanna disappear before Western became a relevant concept? And second of all, like, correct me if I'm wrong, please do, but I think it's not unreasonable to argue that it was actually Westerners who, maybe through, well, actually, I think it was Westerners who actually rediscovered her for us to learn about. Maybe it was a mix of colonialism and just like venturing into the Near East. But maybe the interest in Inanna came precisely with Western wisdom.
Well, I'll just say briefly that it was English gentlemen and German gentlemen and entrepreneurs, scholars who discovered pile upon pile of cuneiform tablets. And there was an Englishman, I think his name was Smith, who figured out how to translate them and understand the Sumerian language. There are many languages written in cuneiform, but Sumerian was one of them. And he read the story of Inanna to the Royal Society in London. I'd have to look back at the exact date, somewhere in the 1800s, probably late 1800s. And it was like a bombshell, because at that period of time, people thought that the Bible was divinely inspired by God and delivered exclusively to Moses and the Jewish people. And they're seeing all of these stories. Doesn't necessarily, disprove those beliefs, but they're seeing all these stories which made them question that belief, because these stories if there's truths in the story, these truths had been disclosed to other people, and it wasn't disclosed by God, the Jewish God, and it was disclosed to these other people at an earlier date. So that really led to a lot of study and soul searching, which hasn't stopped even today.
Thank you, Myron. Up next, I have Ryan, followed by Ella.
Yes, hi. Well, it's such a broad topic, and I think all of it's very interesting. The most kind of insight I gained was from back when you're mentioning the Egyptian crops and how the cats were the feminine spirit protecting your harvest. And that was originally the snake, I guess, in ancient Sumeria. And how it's also such a strong form of power, this ability to accept death and then shed your skin and regrow. I think that's what we were kind of missing from Western societies. We don't honor that process very much. We're afraid of snakes. We're not seen as something very positive.
Yes, and it's also seen as that insight as regards snakes fed into the medical profession as it's evolved over the centuries. They were the symbol of the snake with the caduceus, and I can't remember the name of the Greek god who was the god of medicine, but he had a snake, and the idea not just that the snake could not just be reborn, but revitalize itself, could cure itself. The idea there was to cure itself, and it had this amazing power. And that's kind of fed into the Greek understanding of medicine, and that the patient, it's nature that cures the patient. The Hippocratic oath is don't do harm, you help the body cure itself. And then the other analogy is that you can have transformations. It's not just life, the actual death of the body. Then in the life, during a person's life, there can be multiple transformations that are analogous to the shedding of the skin and a rebirth by the snake.
Yeah, I like that word, the transformations. I think that's the new subject that brought, to me at least, divine femininity. Is it's more of a it's like a creative transformation process.
Yes, I think that's something that in the traditions has been unique to the goddesses, I would say.
Yeah, just to bring up one additional point about transformation, in various religions, transformation kind of has a form of a death to what you knew, a death to the attachment that you have to a certain thing or a place or a person, and you need to let that die off, which is like the essentially destruction, in order to be able to transform. Like, you can't do it without it. So rather than death being something that you're scared of, looking at it through life, like while you're living, is something that is essential in order to transform.
Yeah.
Right.
I was just going to say it's almost the opposite. When you think of a patriarchal kind of mind frame, it's like, oh, I just have skills, and I have more skills that I can attain, and I can just keep carrying everything. And it's like No, not really. Eventually, we have limits of what we can carry.
Agreed.
Yes, I think those are great insights.
Yep.
Thank you.
Up next, we have Ella.
Yes, oops, am I unmuted? Yes. Okay, yeah, I was just thinking, I hope we can have a discussion on that important question of what happened to the goddesses and what happened to them and how it has affected all of us, but particularly women. And because how do women transition with religion confirming their place as they're hardly mentioned in any important respect in any of the religions. And so I would like to inquire into in maybe another session, as we had discussed, as to how this happened and what the effect of it is on all of us. If we could do that sometime.
Well, to me, it makes sense if we start doing that at our next session. There seems to be a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, sure. We could talk about it, how to do that in our next session. Up next, though, we have David, followed by Ryan.
Yes, as I pointed out earlier, the scholars are claiming that it was the pagan trinities of the Holy Father, the Mother, and the Son that influenced the development of the Christian Trinity. But what I would assert that the particular variety of Christianity that the Roman emperors chose to support out of the umpteen dozen others, and all the others, of course, got suppressed, versions of Christianity. Unfortunately, the assertion I'm making is that they hate women. And we've still got this problem to this very day with, female priests and priests, etc. The opposition to it all. Anyway, as a consequence, what they did to the Holy Mother was new to her. And she's now the Holy Ghost in the Trinity. So she's either seen as neuter or male. So that's what happened to the Holy Mother. But round about just before 400 AD, when the Imperial Christian Church.
David, can I just stop for a minute? Because I don't think a lot of people are really familiar with all of this. So we kind of want to keep it on Inanna.
Okay, well, I'm about to mention it. They crushed the Isis religion. The Isis religion was crushed 391 AD, the exact date. Now, the church being cunning, they wanted to get all the adherents of Isis into the church. So the smartest thing to have done would have been to reinstate the Holy Mother as part of the Trinity. But of course, they couldn't do that. So what they did was they've made Isis Mother of God. So this is the beginnings of the Mary cult. So the Holy Virgin Mary becomes Mother of God, and she's been incorporated in that sense back into Christianity, particularly, of course, as we know, with the Roman Catholic and Orthodox versions, not so much in the Protestant, but there we are, you see. So it's it's an attempt to reincorporate the mother figure back into the religion, Christianity. So it's interesting, in my view.
Thank you, David. Up next, I have Ryan, followed by Myron.
Yes, thank you, David. I couldn't agree with you more on that. and I guess that was kind of in response to what Ella was saying as well. And what I had wanted to touch back is like, where are these stories of the Divine Mother? You know, we have the Mother of Christ, but that's really watered down. I think that's the most important part, is you're going to have to create new stories of these creation tales. And I think that's like bringing back that into our society. If we're lacking that and needs to be shared, it's going to be a process of creation. And what do you get out of this? What is it personal? What do these things really mean to you? Because that's what we did for thousands of years. We just kept telling these same stories over and over and over again. And so if you don't know it personally, that's when it gets lost. You don't have anything to tell anybody about it.
Right. That's right.
Thank you, Ryan. Up next, I have Myron, followed by Joe.
Can I say one thing about what was just said?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with that. And I think when we will try to do this topic as the next one, we'll get into the history and some of the events, but the way it was just laid out is exactly if you will, the conclusion and the challenge that we face.
Oh, thank you. Up next, I have Myron, and Joe disappeared. Oh, he lowered his head. So up next, we have Myron.
Yeah. So I think at least one, maybe a few times here, we brought up the fascinating possibility of whether or not the Christian Trinity, I think Father, Son, Holy Spirit was a result of, I guess, watering down the Holy Mother. And that's certainly really important to think about. But I have to admit that the way I learned about the history of the Trinity was a little different. I think what I learned was that it was an internal Christian, compromise between people who adamantly believed in either the divine or the human nature of Jesus, or maybe a bit of both. And that was I think the context of the Trinity, at least the way I learned it. And things were banished, but it wasn't like the Holy Mother. It was other sects of Christianity that got banished as a result of the establishment of this Trinity.
Thank you, Myron.
It'll be interesting to get into that. I don't know that much about this early New Testament history. It all sounds right. I've read about the Old Testament history, and I'll try to get into that, hopefully with Penny's help. Because she's read a lot about it too. But wow, that's really fascinating stuff. And I think it's important, it's relevant to appreciate that.
Thank you, Brian. So I know Shrikant wants to make an announcement about a new book that he wants to cover. So Shrikant, if you're there.
Wonderful. I am ready. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Evanique, and thank you, Brian. I want to tell you about the meetups coming up. Some really, really exciting meetups coming up. We are starting the series on Goethe's Faust. And that is going to be next Sunday, starting next Sunday. Sunday is going to be an introductory meetup at 5 p.m. Eastern time. Phil, who did Dante and Dostoevsky for us, is going to be leading this meetup. I've just announced it. So it's going to be Sundays, every other Sunday. It's going to be a 10-part meetup. So join us. Faust is one of the deepest works of literature. And Goethe is one of the most amazing thinkers of all times. And it integrates with many of the themes that we have been studying. So I recommend it highly. So that's number one. Number two, we have a new meetup, new series, a monthly series coming up on designing your life. It's self-improvement meetup. That's going to be Tuesday at 7 p.m. Starting next, is it next Tuesday? Joe, can you talk just a
27th.
little bit about it? 27th. Okay. 27th. Can you talk a little bit about what you'll be doing at the meetup?
Sure. I mean, we're going to be sourcing opinions from everyone during the first one, but essentially what we're trying to do is take some of the concepts that we've learned here at 52 Living Ideas, and, you know, whether it be the Bhagavad Gita, whether it be Stoicism or the Tao Te Ching, and see how it has practically impacted our lives. And we're going to have different presenters each month. We're also actually in the process of reaching out to a couple different people to potentially present. And so it's going to be like a very practical philosophy kind of meetup, and how we can intentionally, and we'll link some of it back to the design way as well, kind of create how we intentionally design our lives.
Wonderful. Thank you. And then I want to tell you about the next series. Gita meetups are coming to an end, and we're going to do about 3 or 4 meetups. The last meetup in the Gita series is going to be, I think, 5th of next month. So the week after that, on Thursdays, we are starting a series on how to speak and how to write. It is based on this book called Clear and Simple as Truth. It is one of the deepest books I have read, not only on language, but on epistemology, on thinking. I just discovered it 48 hours ago, and I have read the entire book once in 48 hours, and I've begun my second reading of it. The problem is that the language is so powerful that I'm having difficulty reading other books now, because my mind is rebelling against the language of many other books. So I will tell you briefly about it, because it's a very, very deep idea. The authors, Joe, can you do me a favor and put a link to the book? Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I actually might have found actually a free version of it. So too. So.
Okay, just go ahead and put the Amazon link so people can buy it. Now, the authors make a point that people have different styles. There are different styles that exist. There is the plain style, assuming that everybody can speak, that even a child can speak in that or write in that. There is a practical style, which is the focus of the practical style is for somebody who knows how to do something to explain to another person how to do it in the most direct way possible without wasting their time. Then there is a introspective, contemplative style where you're trying to show, we're trying to put down how your mind is working and what you're feeling. Then there is the romantic style, which says that you get these inspirations, and only some people get these inspirations about reality at different points, and you're trying to desperately capture those. The classic style, which this book talks about, is none of these. The classic style was developed in the 17th century in France, and then it spread. It became a very dominant style in France, but there are some incredible practitioners of it elsewhere. For example, Mark Twain is a very good example in the American context. Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence is a good example of that. What this style does is that it is rooted in a writer trying to address the individual mind. These authors make a brilliant point. They say that all these different styles actually have different philosophies on 4 different issues. The first one is truth. The classic style holds that there is truth. Reality is what it is, and you can understand it, you can grasp it, and you can communicate it. For example, there is subjective style, which says that there is no truth. There is romantic style, which says that only few people, special people, have these bursts of insight where they understand something and they're not really communicable. The plain style holds that truth, anybody can understand truth. And now plain style differs. It is the classic style encompasses everything of the plain style, but adds that there are things in this world which children cannot understand. You need a large context and you need to be able to integrate a lot of things in order to understand it. So it is different in that respect. So truth, your approach towards truth is the first difference. The second is your attitude about presentation. The classic style holds that the function of presentation is to show the truth, to present the truth to the reader. It has a profound respect for the reader. It holds that all the author has to do is to use the medium of writing or speaking to direct the attention of the listener or the reader to the truth, and the reader can grasp it. So the presentation at its best, people should not be aware of the presentation. They should be focused on the truth through the presentation. Much of the romantic style will focus a lot on presentation. The subjective style is talking about how you are reacting to things. So it differs in that. Next is the third one, and which is really the heart of the whole thing, is what they call a scene. What is the context? What is the context of communication? The classic style is rooted in one person, 2 people talking to each other in speech about something that they can see perceptually. That is the root base, foundation on which it is based. It is not an oratorial style. It is not a style of giving specific instruction to specific people wanting to do specific things. It is speaking about truth directly to another mind. Lastly, about thought and language. The style holds that you work out your thought beforehand and then you speak the thought or you write the thought. So writing is not, this writing in classic style is not about thinking through things. It is to present what you have thought. So these are the differences. Now, the way in which the classic style, for example, the great examples of classic style is almost all great science writing by people like Feynman, Newton's optics, Darwin's Origin of Species, Lavoisier's Elements, Faraday's experiments. If you read these works, they're very accessible. They're accessible to anybody. They're talking about concretes, but they naturally go into the most abstract things from concretes. So there is this play between abstracts and concretes. It starts with concretes and raises to abstracts effortlessly, beautifully, simply, directly. There are 3 hallmarks of this style, of how it is done. One, it starts with this, what is called the classic scene of 2 people talking to each other about some concrete object like a pigeon. And then that's the first step. You have to really be able to do that. Otherwise, you can't really do communication, it holds. You can't speak and you can't write. Once you do that, the second step is what they call blending. So you blend your inferences, larger network of your observations, the cultural context, the conceptual context into this core scene. So you present all your abstractions as integrated into those percepts. So that's the second step. The third step, they call it compression. I call it metaphors. It is about using the rhythms and observations of the physical world to create corresponding rhythms in the conceptual world, in the inner life, to make it happen. I'm going to give you one example of this, which is one of the best examples. One of the greatest exponents of this is Mark Twain. Whenever he writes anything nonfiction, the classic example would be The Life on the Mississippi. Now, I don't have the text with me, but I'm going to just paraphrase him. He says, I lived in this small town on Mississippi, and nothing really happened in this town most of the time. Sometimes a circus would come through and all the boys would dream of being trapeze artists for a short time. Then a minstrel troupe would come through and all the boys would dream of being in the band for a short time. And then a steamship would come through. And that was different because the prospect of visiting all these towns and all this life up and down the river the excitement of that would remain with us boys throughout. And then the next ship would come in and the excitement would increase until a boy jumps onto this steamship somehow and starts to explore that world. Now, notice how these three elements come in. He starts with description of physical things. Now, I have actually not seen it. This happened over 100 years ago. But the way he describes it, all of it, comes, I can connect it to the mental network we have. Here is the problem of communication. Our brain is a network. Reality is a network of these dense connections, millions of connections. That is what is there in your head. And similarly, there is this network in the other person's head. Yet, language is sequential. How do you communicate from this one giant network, complex network, to another network through this linear means? That is the problem that the classic style is trying to solve. And how does he solve it? By rooting it, by grounding it in percepts. Whatever his words have come in to my consciousness, I am able to ground it in my own percepts. And then he starts to build up things. He's saying that there is this excitement that happens and then it peters out. There is this excitement that happens and peters out. And there is a kind of excitement that remains and keeps building. Now, these are physical movements that he's talking about that map into what goes on in how we experience things, in our motivations. So he moves from description of physical things to inferences through cultural context, through motivations, evaluations, the deep ideas of curiosity and value of curiosity, a sense of adventure, without actually talking about them explicitly. This is a classic example of the classic style. Now, all of this is just first two parts of the book. The reason this book is great is the third part. The authors start by saying, this is a very easy style to master. And they have a set of exercises which have been done over the ages since 17th century. Some version of these that you can go these step by step. You first master how to talk about a concrete thing to a person that you're sitting next to, both of you are looking at that. Then you start to try to do the same thing with somebody on the phone who's not seeing that. Then you throw in your inferences, then you bring in the cultural context, you put in more abstract things, and you build things up that way. So it is a series of exercises which help you build this habit. Because this is really not about writing, it is about speaking. It is not really about speaking, it is about thinking. So it is a way of changing how you think in a grounded way. So not only you understand things better, but you can communicate it better. The first set of exercises are only on speaking. And it holds that you first have to master speaking like this, and then you can go to writing. So what we are going to do is, once the Gita Meetups is over, on Thursdays, I think it's the first is 13th of October, we are going to start doing exercises. We won't be recording the exercises because the purpose here is to just learn how to speak first. A large part of the exercises is, first set of exercises is about that. And then we are going to, then we build up writing on the top of that. So it's the most incredible book. I wanted to try it out. I always do experiments. So I was meeting with a friend and I said, I did not tell him all of this background. And I said, look, there is this book I've read and I have some exercises. Do you want to try them? He said, sure. And we spent about a couple of hours doing these exercises, first 5 exercises. And his reaction afterwards was, I did not know that I could speak this articulately about concrete things. And when I talked about description of people, that was pretty good. But when it came to describing what is happening between people, I was terrible. So you actually figure out where you are, what kind of style. So for example, I use a combination of the plain style, the practical style, introspective style, and maybe a little bit of romantic style as a combination of my speech. So you get a sense of what are you actually using, and you will be able to, through these exercises, to build this up. What I'm going to do is that this Saturday, I'm starting this in person in New York. And then I'm going to test it out in a small group of people in person. And then we will do this as weekly meetups on Thursdays at 9 p.m. So I invite all of you. If you guys have any reaction to this, whether you think this is interesting, what do you think? I really want to hear this because because this is not, this is a level of meetup which is actually a lot more commitment, because either you are going to change the way you write, speak, and think, or you're not. Just watching it is not going to do any good to you. Even if you learn everything, it's not going to do anything good to you. You have to actually internalize it. And so it's going to be like a workshop where we'll use Toastmaster-like format. So everybody gets to talk and everybody gets to do exercises. it is really going to be amazing to watch other people do exercises. We'll pick up things from each other as we progress. So I would love to hear what you guys think. Anybody?
I think,
We'll start- go ahead.
well, let
Let's go
Myron.
with Myron first. Myron.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to learn more about these in-person meetings in New York. I went to like a language exchange meetup a while ago. I wonder if in a sense you're kind of aiming for that. Just
Oh,
not,
are you in New York?
yeah, I'm in New York.
Okay. I will message you. It's going to be in Bryant Park at 1 p.m.
Yeah.
This Saturday. So you can just show up at the Bryant Park fountain.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Any comments?
I'm very interested in this. I mean, because this is one of the things that, having how to tap into our minds, the network, and actually express ourselves clearly. I think that that's what we try and do here all the time. So having a workshop that actually gives us a way, a process, I really would appreciate. I am going to appreciate it. So that, and it is going to be a commitment. It's going to be a very, very heavy commitment, but I think it'll be worthwhile. I think that this is actually something that will improve 52 living ideas as a whole for anybody that participates.
No, absolutely. I think it's going to make all communication better, everybody's communication better. So great. I'm glad. And go ahead. Anybody else? All right. Okay, so go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, that sounds like a really interesting idea. Thanks for sharing. I already bought the book. So
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah, I'm interested too. I think it'll be fun.
Yes, it's great. So I recommend getting the book, reading it. I'm in the process of reading it the second time. And I'm starting to do exercises with as many people as it's very easy to integrate exercises like this into anything that you're doing. So I'm already doing that. I'm glad. I think we're going to have a good group of people. And the requirement is going to be that, everybody reads the book. And we're not going to be describing the book or anything like that. Might give a really short introduction like I did now to get things started. But most of it is going to be simply people speaking about things and learning how to speak. All right, wonderful.
Yep. I got the book too. It's on my Kindle.
Excellent. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Evanique and Brian. See you folks soon.
Welcome.
Thank
Bye.
you, Brian. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ebony.
Thank you, Brian and Ebony.
You're
You're
welcome.
welcome, guys.